This review is brought to you in part by Ryder's Hobby Shops, where the fun begins. Stop in to one of Ryder's two convenient Michigan locations where you'll find a full range of the latest hobby products, supplies, parts, tools, and paint. This review covers the 1969 Plymouth GTX Hardtop Pro Street. It's a 125 scale kit from AMT number 1180. Back in 1968, Chrysler's B-body cars, including the Plymouth GTX, were given a great new look. Now with a new hourglass body, it replaced the previous flat-sided design and included a standard 375 horsepower high-performance Magnum 440 V8. It was standard, along with the TorqueFlite automatic transmission. Now, there was also an optional 425 horsepower 426 Hemi, which is the subject of this kit, which was available in the real car. I'd rate this kit for intermediates to advanced builders as aligning some suspension parts, so lack of some gluing points, and they can make it a challenge. Even painting the thin chrome trim can take a steady hand. Now, the kit was first introduced in '91 and then reissued in 2020 by AMT with new decals. There's 121 parts molded in white, clear red, black vinyl, clear, and chrome-plated pieces. When you're done, the kit's about 8.5 inches long, 3¼ inches wide, and 2½ inches tall. Here are the contents of the kit. As you can see, there's a number of trees, including two nice chrome trees, and really bigs and littles for the Pro Street car. The glass is nice and clear, but it's pretty thick. There is a little bit of distortion. And on the sprues, the attachment points are pretty thick, so they'll need a little extra care when removing parts from them. Here are the decals for the kit, and these turned out to be problematic, but we'll talk about that later. The register was good and the colors are pretty nice, but you can only match those colors to certain body colors. Now remember to use the manufacturer's safety and use guidelines when you use any of the products that you see or hear in the review. After a warm water soap and dish soap cleanup and thoroughly drying the parts, I gave them a light coating of black primer. Construction begins with the engine, and as you can see, the block was left unpainted so that the Hemi orange would pop. But first you can assemble the block and clean up any issues or sprue attachment points, etc. from the pieces. And then go ahead and once the block has been assembled and completely dried, I gave it a coat of Tamiya X6 orange paint to represent the Hemi orange. Now we can add some of the other pieces. As you can see, the headers have been assembled and attached to the heads. Now, using a small brush, I had painted flat aluminum on the transmission and the headers, and then I'm going to dirty those up later with some dry brushing of some flat red brown. That's Tamiya XF64. Then I painted the pulleys and the starter with some X18 semi-gloss black, and finally I got the chrome parts out and cleaned them up and touched up any missing chrome with the Molotow chrome pen. Now, after I had scraped any of the paint and chrome from the gluing points, which you'll have to do throughout the build, using a hobby knife I glued the valve covers and then the intake manifold carbs to the engine, and I gave it a black wash with some Tamiya black panel line wash. I removed the unwanted wash with a little thinner and a cotton swab. Now, I hadn't decided on the carburetor's top parts yet, so I found that no option would allow for the hood scoop, so I might go with the custom filters on those. Next, we turn our attention to the interior. You see the nice roll bar there, and of course a nice satin black for the interior pieces. Now, I removed the parts from the sprue of OK and cleaned up the imperfections and touched those edges up. And I decided to detail the parts with some chrome pen and some XF7 flat red for the headrest and the seat belts. But I didn't like the chrome dash plate. That's part 120, so I wanted to use the decal for that. When I put the decal in the water, it just exploded into pieces. Fortunately, there was two of them, and I was able to get the second one in place and meld it back together with some setting solution. And then I coated the decal with some pledge to kind of set it into position and let that dry overnight. Next, you can assemble the interior after scraping any of the paint off from the gluing points. I put the roll bar in first so as to have clearance to make sure that it wasn't interfered with the seats and my fingers. And as you can see, it's turning out to be a pretty nice looking interior. The seats with the 3-point harnesses are looking really nice. And of course the dashboard turned out pretty well despite the problems with the decals. So I had to just touch up where I took it off of the sprue pieces and cleaned it up, and it turned out very nice. I turned my attention then to the front part of the engine bay, etc. And as you can see in this shot, the firewall is attached with some really large sprue attachment points. I actually had to use a razor saw to cut those off and then clean them up. And that's kind of symptomatic of the early 90s AMT kits. So they take a little extra attention. But once I'd done that and removed all the front pieces, including the some of the auxiliary ones like the wiper motors, master cylinder, etc., the lower unibody from the sprues, I cleaned those up and did the same thing. And then I glued the engine compartment pieces together and touched up the paint where they had been removed from the sprue, and glued the wiper motor into place, but there's no positive attachment point and placement was vague, so it's just a guess. That's where I put it in the red circle. Next, I cleaned up all the pieces that go into the front end there, and scraped any glue from gluing points in the engine compartment. And after I removed any chrome and also from the some of those pieces that are attachments, I glued the engine to the subframe, locating the motor mounts and using some good strong glue there. And then the radiator support went in using some slow setting cement. And then I glued the support to the front of the engine, and the attachment points were very good. Before that dries, glue the fans and the hoses into place in case you need a micro adjustment there for position. And then I glued in the horns, the overflow tank, and the battery, and detailed those pieces with white and gray and also a chrome pen. Now we'll work on the tires, and they're pretty impressive. Those big tires in the back look great, and you'll want to clean them up, any imperfections, and scuff the tread with a little light sandpaper. We're going to put the wheels together by removing the paint and chrome from where the glue points are, and then set the hubs into the wheel backs. Place that on one side of the tire and glue the rim to the wheel back on the inside there where those the round parts touch. And then make sure you don't get any on the hub there if you want the wheels to spin. And next we're going to clean up the front spindles, lower suspension, and sway bar. Now the assembly wasn't meant to be steerable, but if you glue the lower suspension to the frame and just sandwich the spindles in between, they will actually position for like being in a turn. Finally, I glued the wheels on and then the sway bar in place and touched up any paint that got removed for gluing. And now we'll take a look at those rear tires, those great big Mickey Thompsons. You're going to clean those up the same way as the front. And by the way, the center line wheels here, the deep dish and the ones in front, are really nice addition for this model. So go ahead and assemble them in the same manner that you did the front. And then we're going to install the rest of the parts here, as you see, in the rear end. Start by gluing the rear axle halves together, followed by gluing on the differential cover and let that dry. And using some slow setting cement, glue the springs to the frame and the rear axle. Remember to remove any paint so that the glue will stick. Now, tipping the axle to the rear, slide the driveline in between the axle and the transmission. Then glue the wheelie bars to lock everything in place. To make sure everything is square and true, look it up over, nicely. And I had to adjust one of the wheelie bars so they would be level. Next, glue the exhaust into place And I drilled out the exhaust tips for a little extra realism. Now touch up the paint and weather up the exhaust with some silver and rust tones. And don't forget to paint the wheelie bar wheels rubber black. After the suspension is dry, glue the wheels to the axle. And now you have a rolling chassis that sits on all four wheels. And now we'll work on the body and the hood. So go ahead and work on any of the parting lines that you find on the quarters and ridges of the fenders, etc. Any imperfections, clean those up, and then give it a light coat or two of some sanding primer, and then a light sand, and then wipe her down clean or wash it, and then let it set and dry. And next we'll cut out the hood hole there for the high-rise intake, and underneath there's a recessed area, and then just use the backside of a X-Acto blade and continue to scribe that until you cut through, and then clean it up with sanding files and perhaps round files, etc. Whatever you have to clean up that hole. And then once that has thoroughly dried, we're going to give it a nice 3 coats of X7 red from Tamiya, and then smoothing the paint with a 2000 grit wet sand in between coats, those are color sanding. And then I masked off the red and painted the lower body with some X1 black in the same manner. Next we get into the finishing phase of the body. You can see we need to gather up the bumpers and the glass, etc. here. And using a chrome pen, I painted all the trim work, but you'll want to use a nice, clean, fresh pen to make sure that you can touch those highlighted areas cleanly. Now, I glued the clear parts in with some clear part cement, or you can use white glue, and the fit was very nice. I gave the grill and the back plate a black wash, and then I glued them into position. Next, I added the taillights into the bezels with some clear part cement, and glued the bezels into the body. Finally, I glued the interior rear view mirror with some clear part cement into place, and then glued the front and rear bumpers on too. Next, I test fitted the interior into the body to find some gluing points, since there weren't really any ones that were evident from the drawings. And then after making a few notations, I glued the interior into position. And I found I had the same problem with the chassis, so you'll have to test fit that and look for gluing points, and then use some strong glue to glue these units into position. And I decided on using this particular air filter package that I wanted on the engine, so I gave those a black wash and glued them onto the carburetors. And I wanted to do the decals next before gluing the side mirrors on. Next, I started with the front marker lights, and the first marker light that I put into water broke into 3 pieces, which I had to section back together and kind of place, and that was kind of my first clue. The other went on just fine, so I thought it might have been a fluke. Unfortunately, as you see here, I was going to use the large stripes for emphasis, but they were just too fragile and obviously had micro cracks in them, and as soon as they hit the water, they just break all apart. They're also thin to begin with, so the operating word here is overspray your older decals if you need to make sure that they stay together, and you'll also have to cut those out separately if you do that. But what you can do is try some decals from your sheet that you're not going to use and see how they react in the water. Here are the parts that I had left over. Some of these are optional parts for this kit, and there's also some in there that I think for other kit versions. Well, there you have it. After a coating of Pledge Floor Care to give it some gloss, your model is finally done. It looks great, and a prime example of the height of the era of the muscle car. This Pro Street version obviously isn't something you'd just drive on long trips. In fact, you might want to refine that and just go down the quarter mile. But nonetheless, it looks great. And although the kit has its issues, from being molded back in the early 90s, it still looks great when you're done. since subject matter is king, this is one of the models that you should buy and put on your shelf. We hope you like this premium scale model kit review, and so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can do that by clicking on the icon in the lower right of any of our reviews, and you can find us on Facebook or our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks.